My name is Bob Weber with Construx. Welcome to our session on Agile motivation. I think you'll find that this is an interesting and different approach to what you've seen in motivation, and we can apply it directly to how we manage our Agile teams. So Construx goes through a lot of organizations. We see, very highly motivated teams, people staying late, everybody excited, people doing everything to get the job done, removing obstacles. And then we also see teams that are, I would say, really not highly motivated. They're doing what they're asked to be done. They all go home at the same time. And so what's the difference? Now, of course, I would say that most of you have read a lot of books on motivation. There are a lot of books on motivation, but we don't find that there are many motivated teams. It's actually quite unusual. So why is that? We think that there's something missing in the way we're addressing motivation. So we're going to take a scientific or engineering approach to motivation to break it down to understand what creates motivation and then how we can increase it. Okay, so we're going to talk about behavior. The reason is if we look at the definition of motivation here, here's one. We talk about it's a reason for acting or it's about behaving in a particular way. So if we can manage and understand behavior, then we can understand motivation. Okay, so I call this session Organizational Behavior for Engineers. I'm an engineer. I think most of you out there are engineers. So when I hear the word behavior, when I was an engineer, I would get very skeptical because I didn't think this behavioral theory applied to us. We're professionals and whatnot. So I had kind of a major change in my thinking. Several years ago, I was with a large telecommunications company. We had been sacrificing quality under high pressure. The farther we get behind, the more pressure. I'm sure you've all been there. And they brought in a new VP to put us on the right track. So I became a director at that time with a group about 300 people. The R&D group total was about 1,500 people. And the VP hired somebody for the head of quality. And this was a woman with a PhD in organizational behavior. Now, of course, am I skeptical? Absolutely. Well, to make a long story short, we did apply the organizational behavior principles to quality because we recognized that improving quality required certain behaviors like reviewing code, writing unit tests, etc. So we're not going to talk about that today, but I'm going to talk about the model that I learned, which is very applicable. It also didn't hurt that I married this PhD in organizational behavior. She's been my coach in this for my whole career, and it's really entitled me to build really high-performing teams, so I know this really works. So she brought in this consultant named Aubrey Daniels. He's known as the father of performance management. He's one of the first clinical psychologists to really apply behavioral theory to the workplace. Now, we took it and applied it to an engineering organization, and we did make some differences because engineers, yes, they are a little different than other people. What motivates them is different. So I'm going to go through the model I learned, and then we'll understand how it applies to engineering situations, then we'll apply to Agile. So bear with me. If you're skeptical, please bear with me till we get through this part. I promise you that you're going to see a very analytical and easy way to manage behaviors. And in fact, I can show you results. Okay, so in the model, this is Aubrey Daniels' model. We talk about antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So an antecedent is what precedes the behavior, like asking somebody to do something would be an antecedent. I would like you to write your unit tests. As a result, we expect some behavior. We expect somebody is going to actually write the unit test as a result of the behavior. And as a result of that behavior, they'll experience some consequences. I might recognize the engineer by saying, whoa, great job. I really appreciate you getting unit tests done. So the interesting thing about this model is that it's the consequences that really predict the behavior, not the antecedent. Now, let me illustrate this. You have an engineer in your group. There's a program review meeting coming up, and you want to give them the opportunity to show something really cool to the rest of the executives. They put the presentation together, go in the room, They did the presentation, and everybody criticized the presentation of what they missed. They felt very embarrassed by what they did. And in that case, they received a very negative welcome for the presentation. Now, the other case is the positive case where they go in, give the presentation, a lot of clapping, a lot of recognition, everything is great. Now, you go back the next month and you want the same behavior. So you ask that engineer to put together a presentation for the upcoming program review. Do you think the outcome, the behavior, is going to be different in each of those cases? Well, yes, it is. For that engineer who really was embarrassed or punished during that presentation, they're going to give all kinds of reasons why they cannot get a presentation ready or it's not worth presenting. However, that person who received what we call positive reinforcement, they came to you a week after the presentation and said, gee, when can I get back on the program review? So we see that it's the consequences that people experience that really predict the strength of the behavior. Okay, so why do we talk about behaviors? If you think about it, especially, if you're a leader, it's a leadership conference, most of what you do is you manage behaviors. You don't produce the results. You don't do the coding. You don't do the testing. You produce the results. And so we do know that all results come from behaviors. So as a leader, it's important that you understand how to manage behaviors. Now, we're not talking about anything manipulative here. We're just trying to get a basic understanding of human behavior. So this was introduced to me, and being an engineer, I looked at this and thought, oh, okay, it's a matrix. That looks more analytical, a little more interesting to me. And so we break down consequences into several different categories. People either get what they want, get what they don't get what they want, or don't get what they don't want. Let me illustrate that. Okay, so when people get what they want, most of you have heard that term before, it's positive reinforcement. That's exactly what it means. Somebody gets some recognition for something they did, positive reinforcement. If people get what they don't want, that's punishment, i.e. somebody did something and they got yelled at, they got what they didn't want. That's what we call punishment. People don't get what they want, we call that extinction. I'll show you examples of these in the engineering world in a few minutes, but let's get through these. People don't get what they call that extinction. So the best way to look at that is you have an engineer in your group who's always telling jokes at your staff meeting, taking everything off track, and everybody laughs. Now, all of a sudden, nobody laughs at the jokes. What happens? We would find that the person would actually stop telling jokes because they want the laughter. So they don't get what they don't want in this case. The extinction, the basic laughter is extinguished. Now, this is the tricky one. Negative reinforcement is people don't get what they don't want. Now, the best way to explain this is like somebody working under threat of punishment, but not really being punished. That's the difference. If somebody gets punished for doing the behavior, they actually receive the punishment. If people are working under the threat of punishment, they don't want to get the punishment. That's called negative reinforcement. Now, the reason we break these up into 4 is that only positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement increase behavior. Yes, you can increase behavior by threatening people. Now, I'm not going to recommend that. Certainly in this day and age with our engineers, it's just not going to work. So we want to make sure that we focus on the positive reinforcement. All right, punishment and extinction decrease behavior. We talked about the jokes. If you punish somebody for doing something, they will decrease. Okay, so we have 4 categories of consequences. So let's go through some examples. A developer is at a demonstration, real cool demonstration. Everybody gives them applause. That's positive reinforcement. CEO yells at a project manager for late project warning. The behavior was telling the CEO that the project is going to be late. They got yelled at. That was very punishing. Now, how likely is it that that project manager is going to go back in the office the next week with a warning? They're not going to go back there. All right, innovation. Manager ignores product ideas. We see organizations that talk about innovation. We love innovation, but basically they ignore them. When somebody brings up good ideas, it's, yes, I know, but we've really got to get this sprint completed. We don't have time to do that. So what happens if you ignore these ideas over time? It's extinction. Of course, the ultimate negative reinforcement is meet schedule or be fired. That would be negative reinforcement. Now, certainly we don't want people working under threat of being fired. I want to make that clear, but it does increase behavior. People would be more likely to work to meet the schedule. Of course, while they're getting the resume out to leave the company. We need to understand one more dimension of the consequences. They can be either positive, negative, immediate, future, certain, uncertain. Well, positive is positive reinforcement. Negative is either punishment or negative reinforcement. Immediate is really very soon or during the behavior. There's a very sharp time constant in here when it comes to behavior. So it's almost reinforcement right after the behavior. Future is the reinforcement occurs sometimes in the future. Certain, uncertain, how likely is it to happen based on their experience? Will this consequence occur almost certainly or uncertainly? Now, the reason we break it down, and this is from, I recommend this book, Performance Management, Changing Behavior That Drives Organizational Effectiveness. Aubrey Daniels, I don't have any connection, but he really worked with us to apply this in this telecom company. And what we find is that when things are positive, immediate, certain, or negative, immediate, certain, they have the greatest impact. Immediacy overrides anything else. Now, on the other extreme, when they are positive, future, uncertain, negative, future, uncertain, they don't really influence our behavior for a given time. So that means if you really want to understand how people behave, you really need to look at their short-term consequences. All right, so let's look at some consequences from engineering that we can apply this model to. Praise for completing task on schedule. It's positive, immediate. And, if that tends to happen all the time in the organization, that would be certain. That would be a very strong motivator for somebody. Being yelled at when off schedule, negative, immediate, certain, you would find in the organization that people would try not to go off schedule because it's a negative immediate consequence. Praise for completing on schedule sometimes. Well, the sometimes is the key word here. Positive, immediate, uncertain. So that's not as strong as the PIC. Launch party, i.e. if we complete this release, we're going to have a nice launch party. Hopefully they're positive. Their future, certain, yeah, I say that launch parties always happen no matter how bad the software turns out. But that's my little joke about that. But in this case, let's call it positive, future, certain. Threat of being fired for missing schedule, negative. Future, because you're not being fired at that point. And now it depends on your boss. If your boss tends to fire people when they say this, that would be certain. Otherwise, it would be uncertain. Getting shot down on new ideas, sometimes innovative ideas, negative, immediate, but it's uncertain. Sometimes I come up with an idea and I get recognition. Other times people ignore it or they shoot it down. Bonus for completing project on schedule. Now look at these. We tend to try to rely a lot on these future uncertain consequences, and they don't really have much impact. So bonus for completing project on schedule, positive, future, uncertain. Okay, it's contingent upon completing the schedule. In fact, as an individual, I don't really have much control on whether the whole project meets that schedule. Losing job if project fails, negative, future, uncertain. So remember that these positive, future, uncertain, negative, future, uncertain consequences have very little bearing on behavior. So when we say things like we should work hard to improve the customer experience or to make more money for the company, they are really positive, future, uncertain consequences and don't really have much impact on behavior. We're looking at how people behave during the week that they work. All right, so now we can relate this to employee engagement. As I mentioned, we can use negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement. The bad thing about negative reinforcement is people do the minimum to avoid the punishment. They will meet the goal. They might let other things fall by the wayside, but they will meet the goal, but that's it. You're not going to get anything above that. If you have a culture of positive reinforcement where people have experience in getting positive reinforcement, they will seek reinforcement by doing behaviors above and beyond. So the difference between these, we really call discretionary performance, but it's really, or discretionary effort, but it really is the same as employee engagement. That's what makes the difference between organizations that have engaged employees and those who don't. They're highly motivated because of the positive consequences. So Aubrey, recognized this as well. And so this discretionary effort, or what we would call employee engagement today, is the only way an organization can maximize performance. Okay, so there's the theory. Now let's apply this to your organization and other organizations we see. I used to be puzzled. I was a very positive leader, but I'd be puzzled. Sometimes there'd be an organization that really wasn't getting much done, and some really tough project manager or director would come in. They would lay down the law. They would have people on the carpet for missing their commitments. And you know what? They actually started to meet their commitments. They got the job done. So they moved from actually being a non-performing organization to actually some sustained level of performance. Now, in that case, what they did is that organization increased the negative reinforcement, and that's represented by the left side of this chart, that they went from no consequences to adding negative consequences, and it increased behavior. Now, let's look, what we call that is a compliant. People will do what they're asked to do, but there's nothing more. Now, we have a problem when we go to Agile because we have self-directed teams. We don't have that individual accountability that we used to have, so it's very difficult to apply individual consequences. That means our choices are either we're going to stay in the middle, or we somehow get this employee engagement. Our teams run by themselves. They don't need motivation or reinforcement outside the team. The team itself is engaged. Now, I want to make it clear here, when we get to this side of the chart, this has nothing to do with, a pat on the back once in a while, a Starbucks card. These things are so infrequent, they don't really make much difference. We need to make positive reinforcement part of the job. And interestingly, it's easy to do that in Agile if we do Agile right. Okay, now I've got to cover one other thing here, and that is intrinsic motivation. A lot of people believe that people perform because they're intrinsically motivated. Okay, I do see people who are intrinsically motivated. They work hard no matter what. So if we say that intrinsic motivation is something that comes from within, what is it that produces intrinsic motivation? Is it created, or are people born with intrinsic motivation? Well, I'm going to say that intrinsic motivation is created over time. There is an explanation for that these days, and that is the chemical dopamine, which has been found to act on our pleasure center and is really the basis of positive reinforcement. When you get positive reinforced, when you get something you like, your brain gives you a shot of dopamine, and that makes you feel good. So you like to execute those behaviors that will create the dopamine. Yes, there is a chemical effect to this. So we are going down to a scientific approach here. Now, let's talk about whether motivation is intrinsic or if it's created. All right, let's look at this ice fisherman here who has gone out in the freezing cold, sits there, baits the hook every half hour, sits there in the freezing cold for the day, doesn't catch anything, and they come back the next day, and they continue doing the same thing. So we call them intrinsically motivated because they are doing the behavior without any recognition or reward. So it's intrinsic. Somehow that person just likes to go out there and do the behaviors of fishing whether they catch fish or not. Now, how many of you, of course, I can't see your hands, but I presume many of you have taken a child fishing, or may remember when you were a child fishing, and you put the rod in the child's hand. And what happens? How long does that child sit there with the fishing rod? Well, first question is, where are the fish? Obviously, people are not born to be intrinsically motivated to fish. Something happened to this fisherman. And in fact, what we find is that when you have a history of recognition, which produces dopamine for a behavior, you will tend to continue that behavior whether or not you get the reward. That's what intrinsic motivation is. So if we can set up an environment where people, when they get a lot of reinforcement for the job that they do, for the behaviors that are part of their job, they will increase their motivation. Now, if you don't believe me, I can give you two other examples of how dopamine acts to increase motivation. Video games. In fact, video games have psychologists who really recognize how to reinforce, when to reinforce, to really maximize the addiction. We see that on social media. Slot machines. I personally don't like slot machines, but I see people who sit there a whole day pulling on that slot machine. In fact, they're getting dopamine as they pull that lever. So that behavior has become instilled, and we also call those habits. Okay. So here's what we want to do now. We want to relate this to high-performance Agile teams. How do we create Agile teams that are motivated without any external pressure from management, and they just are thrilled to get the job done? All right. Now, I earlier said that it's all about doing good Agile development. It's not surprising that the practices in Agile are very reinforcing for engineers because it was developed as an engineering framework. So there are a lot of things that they like in there. Now, these are the things that we see in Agile teams that really are high performers. They have to be able to meet their goals consistently. So part of that means that the team set their own sprint goals. We see organizations where these sprint goals are actually set even by product management. They assign them, or by the managers. The idea is that we have to keep these people pressured and have them committed to goals, because that's the way we've motivated people in the past. Okay, so teams have to set their own goals so they can achieve the goals. Management provides support to achieve the goals. That's your role now as a leader. You want to make sure that all obstacles are removed. The team has everything they need. You block frustration from them. You let them focus. And so your role becomes what we call a role of servant leadership. You support the team, you don't direct the team. Now, you do know that you have a highly motivated team because the sprint goals are being achieved 90% of the time. Every 2 weeks, okay, of course, interestingly, shorter sprints are better. It's more opportunity for reinforcement. The 90% of the time is giving you a lot of recognition and reinforcement. So this is a case where we are actually letting the team modify their velocity based on past experience to reduce their sprint points if that's what they need to do to meet the sprint goal. So it's kind of, for people who are used to negative reinforcement, it's counterintuitive. They believe that if you reduce the goal, people will let off. That's true if you are under an environment of negative reinforcement. If you have created this positive environment of where people are frequently recognized, they build this intrinsic reinforcement, they will be highly motivated. Environment facilitates frequent social reinforcement. Now, this is an interesting thing about engineering. It's a little bit different than many other organizations or other industries, is that Engineers have a few things that are really reinforcing to them. You don't need to give them Starbucks cards. You don't need to give them little pat on the back awards. There are a couple of things that they really like. They really like to demonstrate their software to others and get recognition. They also like to have an opportunity to tell what they know. So we don't need material rewards. We just need to rely on the things that motivates engineers, and we can apply this model. So that's why we like to have Kanban boards visible. If we take Kanban boards and we put them in computers where people can update them and look at the status before they come to the meeting or update it, we don't get that social recognition, peer recognition around the Kanban board. What do we see around a Kanban board with an effective team? Somebody moves something on the Kanban board and got it done. People say, wow, great. Thanks for getting that done. I know you worked on the weekend. That's great to get that done. They pull something new from the Kanban board. Wow, I'm not sure we can get that in the sprint, but if you're willing to take it, that's great. So a lot of social reinforcement. Demonstrations are the opportunity for really powerful reinforcement. These can be in sprint reviews, or these can be demonstrations with the product owner during the sprint. Of course, now we have to be sincere. If it's not good, you don't reinforce. You cannot be, people know when you're not being sincere. So, but for the most part, engineers are putting out pretty interesting code. They demonstrate it, and they get recognition for that. They love that. They'll go back and build more code. Information radiators, the same thing happens. If you have charts, graphs, goals that you want people to embrace, it has to be somewhere where there's the social reinforcement around that to create the motivation to improve those goals. So that ties in exactly with our model. So again, this is not doing anything different from what Good Scrum recommends. It just says, make sure you really do it. All right, so what do you need to do as an effective Agile leader? I'm going to give you 5 actions for effective Agile leadership. If you really want to change the way that you manage your teams, from trying to push them to create highly motivated, self-directed teams, you need to do these. Allow the teams to set their sprint goals. Even if it means biting off less work in the next sprint, you want them to consistently meet their sprints. Now, there might be a while before they actually start to get excited about meeting their sprints, but stick with it. Shield the team from external pressure and distractions during sprints. Yes, there's a lot of pressure in the organization. Product management wants everything. Project management wants status. As an effective Agile leader, you are going to shield your team from that. You're going to put an umbrella around your team such that their environment is so simple that they have a product backlog that they can pull sprints stories from on their sprint, and they're left alone to complete that sprint and go on to the next sprint. If they're torn apart, i.e., here's something else we need to do. Why don't we add this in the sprint? They're not going to meet the sprint. So now a lot of organizations, when I explain this to them, they say, yeah, but there's always something that comes up. And I ask them, okay, you're doing 2-week sprints. Yes, there are a lot of things that come up. Can most of those things wait? I know they're important, but can they wait until after the sprint is complete? We're talking about a maximum of 2 weeks. Well, yes, yes, most of them can but sometimes we have these ones where we need all hands on deck. Okay, for those ones, you can interrupt them, but those should be few and far between. Try to set the environment where there's no interruption for the team and no distractions. Quickly remove obstacles. When they get frustrated, something's in their way, you remove obstacles. We often wonder, what is the role of functional management in Scrum? We have the Scrum Master, we have the product owners, everything's working. We do say that the functional managers are for hiring, salary administration, that kind of thing. We need the leaders and managers to play in the game. The way that they can play in the game is that they can actively remove obstacles for the team. One way I recommend that we do that is that management maintains a Kanban board on obstacles that rise up from the teams, and you show progress on that frequently. Your team will start to recognize you as a leader who helps get work done, not one who hinders work. Keep the right people on the team. Yes, this is one of the responsibilities of the leader of the team, of the management. Now, this brings up the question, what do you do when you have poor performers on the team? Now, you do need to be aware of how people are performing on the team. You can get that by talking to people on your team. You know the good people on your team. You can talk to them briefly, how are things going, on the team. And you'll start to know when people are not really contributing. Now, for those people, it's unfortunate that somehow you've not found the motivation, or it could be a skill issue. Now, at this point, you may need to change the person from the team. At this point, you need to contact your human resources organization to understand what is involved with removing somebody from the team. Typically, they want to put somebody on a plan to give them specific goals to either prove that they can do it or to have documentation to remove them. So if people are not performing on the team, basically they work with the team, but they are assigned work according to this plan. Now, either they will start to be able to work hard, or you will start to see that they don't have the skills, or there's nothing that they like about Agile that's motivational for them. At that point, you need to remove that person from the team. Effective teams do not function well when there are people on there not pulling their weight. Account for uncertainty in external commitments. Yes, I'm sure it entered your mind. We are going to let the team work at their own pace, but you've got feature delivery dates from product management. Now, we've known a long time, even with waterfall, that being able to predict software estimates and really deliver a set of software on time, on schedule is very difficult. So we've always missed our commitments. Now with Agile, there's an opportunity to be more flexible, have greater agility, and basically be more predictable for your product management. That involves keeping a set of work that is what we would call the MVP, minimum viable product, that you need to account for in the resources with some spare capacity in case the estimates go up, and very likely they will. The rest of the backlog can be given to the team, and those are nice to have things. So as a leader, you need to manage those commitments for the teams and work with your product management group based on the burn down charts to quickly update the forecast and take action. So what's the test of you being a good leader in Agile? Your teams are winning. You can't make teams pretend that they're winning. Teams have to win, and we know that in Agile by they're meeting their commitments, they're getting their demonstrations done, they're getting a lot of recognition. If it's not happening, you have to go back to these 5 actions and ask yourself, which of these do I need to put in place? All right, you want to go from this. This is the old way of doing things, where we're on top of people, pressuring them, negative reinforcement, to this, self-directed teams, team set goals, team meet goals. You're the servant leader who enables this team to meet their goals and to be successful. Now, how do I know this works? Okay, I'm actually going to give you a test to allow you to determine the level of motivation in your organization. Okay, we go back to this chart. And so the real question is, where is your team on this? Are they working under negative reinforcement? Are they really highly motivated under a lot of frequent positive reinforcement? Or are they kind of in the middle? And people in the middle are really coming into work and doing what they're asked to do. That's not what we want. We want people up at the top of the right-hand side of the curve. So there's a little poll you can do this often in organizations. It's always quite revealing of, again, these are compliance, employee engagement. Very simple poll. It's not a survey. Do not, put a huge employee engagement survey out with 100 questions and try to analyze it. This is a very simple test. Do it quarterly. A little poll. Choose the word that best describes how you feel about your work. Pressured, frustrated, okay, motivated, excited. Now you should see the curve reflected in these answers. People who are pressured are working under negative reinforcement. Now what we've learned is that that's better than okay. Now, you're probably getting more work done because they're pressured than an organization who rates themselves as okay. I look at frustrated because frustrated people are at least trying to get something done. So there is some motivation there, but there are too many obstacles in their way. So that's another category. Okay is not motivated, not excited, not pressured, not frustrated. Now, we used to think that okay was okay. In fact, okay is a failure. If you have 50% of your organization that puts themselves in the okay category, that means that half your workforce is coming to work, doing what they're told to do, no extra effort, no motivation. Now, imagine what you could do if you could motivate or even excite those people. What would happen? Now, what you'll find is that as you use these methods in Agile development to increase motivation, you will see a higher percentage of people rate themselves as motivated and excited. These are the high performance teams. So let me give you an example. This was a major medical device company for which I did a Scrum transition, an Agile transition. It was actually Kanban. And they had we trained all their management. They had gone through and started their process. And I got a call back a few months later and said, it seems like we're kind of reaching a plateau in our performance in Agile. I'm not sure we're getting as much work done as we did before. I said, well, let me come up and see, and I'll watch what's going on. Well, they were violating basically all of the principles we talked about. The stand-up meetings were status meetings conducted by the managers. The managers would go around and ask each person individually what they got done. That was certainly not positive reinforcement. That was not a self-directed team. The other thing we found is they would put a backlog together for a sprint, and it was ripped apart within a few days. All of a sudden, the management would let in new priorities from product management, override it. They'd be taken off on problems. They never had the opportunity to complete their sprints. The management was more interested in directing and controlling than removing obstacles. So I had to take the management again and really point out what they were doing and put in better practices. I asked the managers not to attend the stand-up meetings. Those are for the team themselves. Let the team function. You are the supporting manager. Well, the good thing was they took it to heart. And as you can see, I went back in October or February 2017, and we increased the engaged employees by 39% in 5 months. Now, that's just over a period of 5 months. It was a dramatic change because they completely changed the way that they dealt with the teams. So you can get very rapid results by employing these methods with your teams. Go back to the 5 principles, apply them. You will see that your teams will be motivated. In fact, it makes your job much easier. You don't have to be in there for every obstacle. The team is motivated to remove them. You become the ideal Agile leader, supportive, and really being effective with high performance teams. Okay, so we did leave some time for questions. I hope you've enjoyed what we talked about, and I would enjoy having some questions from you. Buy-in to me means that the motivation doesn't exist, that You have not been able to give the team things that they can win at. So the first place to start is you have to set up the environment with the team to be able to win. That's what creates buy-in, if you want to call it that. They get excited and they will actually start to do that task. So if you have a team with no buy-in, you're either not reinforcing or it's negative reinforcement. Good question. Are there other alternatives to handle individual performance issues? This is a sensitive subject. Some people talk about the Agile teams having their members actually be involved in the performance of people on their team. That's something that you really need to discuss with your HR organization. I mean, even removing somebody from the team that, say, is a protected class can get you into trouble. So involve your HR organization. Let's see. How do you shield teams from sales demands? Sales will be lost without a feature. Yeah, I understand that. It's been my life. First of all, recognize that sales will always push beyond what you can do. So at some point, you need to stand up. Now, this is where leadership comes into play. Leaders are people who can shield the team from that pressure. Yes, you are going to take some flack, and you're probably trying to commit things that you're actually not meeting. Stand up. Get the team to the winning point. You will start to deliver, and people will be happy with what you deliver. Let's see. What do you do about asking teams in retro about their satisfactory score? I'm not quite sure I understand the question here. It's in retro about, going to the team specifically and asking them. You could do that, but the answer is there. You need to, I wouldn't ask them about the score. I would go in and look at why they're not meeting their sprints, why they're not winning consistently. It's a flag to go in and analyze. The teams may not even give you the right answer. They might not know why they're not motivated. But so I would say go in and analyze the team. And let's see. R+, lines of code or reduced bugs or both? Okay, well, reduced bugs, well, I suspect what they're saying here is, can somebody just get reinforcement for developing without being reinforced for bugs? Well, I would expect that in your done criteria in Agile, it does include fixing the bugs at the time, and so that they're combined together. So it is, the reinforcement occurs for meeting the sprint with the expected quality. Let's see. Okay. Is there any relation of positive reinforcement with the idea of creating environments where it promotes autonomy, purpose, and mastery? I anticipated this question because, a lot of people follow Daniel Pink. And first of all, I'm going to say that what Daniel Pink says is not wrong, but I can explain what he says in terms of this behavior model. So the first one is autonomy. So that means that the people need to be able to work in an environment where they can get results that they like to get. That comes in an environment where they actually have a history of getting positive reinforcement. So the autonomy works, in fact, because they're motivated to get results. Mastery. Now let's look at the definition of mastery. Mastery comes from somebody who has conducted certain behaviors over time for their career and gotten recognition for it such that they have become experts in it. So the mastery is really the history of reinforcement. So an Agile team that has, quote, mastery is one that has successfully been able to develop sprints on time. They have mastered that. Now, purpose, I'll be quite honest with you, it doesn't hurt, but it's the least impactful. It's what we would call a positive future uncertain. We could have a purpose of making more money for the company. It's really such a long-term consequence. It really doesn't have much impact. So Daniel Pink's observations are correct, but the question is, how do you create that environment in which those people actually develop the mastery and the autonomy. Okay, good question. How to handle a situation where 40% of the work is more interrupt driven as opposed to plan and keep motivation up. Okay, the first thing is I presume you're doing some kind of Agile. Now, even in Kanban, we are talking about a burning down. And in Kanban, typically we don't have sprints. I saw an earlier question. We do typically like to have a cadence, a cycle of several weeks for people to be able to get things done. Those can be the sources of reinforcement. But anyway, if it's all interrupt driven, the most important thing here is your team, and this is your management responsibility, has to be able to put all their work in one backlog. That includes bug fixing, that includes investigating problems. All that work needs to be taken out of their velocity to account for getting their sprint done that week. So, single backlog with all their work. The second part of that is you need to keep that as stable as possible. As I said, most of the interruptions can wait for at least 2 weeks after the next sprint, and you want to do that as best possible. If you can't make that happen, then I would say you have a chaotic organization and things are probably not going to change. You might want to look somewhere else. All right. Engineers like to demo, not my experience. Thoughts? Okay, that is true. There are engineers who do not like to demo. They're private. In that case, we're probably talking about formal demos where they have to get up and actually demonstrate. A product owner coming around during the sprint and sitting down with them and saying, show me what you work on. I'd be hard pressed to find an engineer who doesn't like to show his work. So you're setting up a demo environment which is not reinforcing to the engineer in that case. What do you think about having teams compete as a way of motivate? Okay. Competing is peer pressure. Now, when I give this class or seminar, I often ask people based on what you've learned, is peer pressure positive or negative reinforcement? Most people say negative reinforcement. Some people say both, and only a few say positive reinforcement. So let's examine that. Let's go back to the definition of positive reinforcement is people get what they want. Now, I don't have people going around often and saying, please give me more pressure. Pressure is something we don't want. So even peer pressure, sure, it's great for the team that wins, but for those that don't, they lose. So when you have competition, you create winners and losers. If you're relying on that, I'd say that's the cheapest form of motivation that you can pull out of your pocket as a leader. If you really want motivation, you don't put teams against each other. You have teams work against their goals. You support them, let them make their goals, and both teams win. Do you think that creating an environment for a growth mindset is important for increasing motivation? Okay, I'd say this is probably going back to Daniel Pink's definition. I think this helps because you could look at growth as something that people want in the future. It's a purpose. But from a day-to-day basis, I've seen highly motivated teams doing maintenance because the work was organized such that they set goals, meet goals, and got a lot of recognition. So I don't think it's an important part of increasing motivation. Let's see. Do you have examples from highly motivated teams? I think this is the last question. Do you have examples from highly motivated teams? Well, I've been fortunate in my career. I did 3 startups after I left a large telecommunications company, and I've always had high performance teams. So the best example is one team where we had an engineer. He was a digital signal processing engineer, very unique skill. He's the only one who knew it. And we had a schedule coming up. The engineer bought a new house, and they wanted to paint the house before the furniture was moved in. So he wanted to take a week off. So the team looked at this, and we all got together and said, let's go paint his house. So we all got together on the weekend, and we went and painted his house inside so he could move the furniture in and come back to work on Monday. Now, is that motivation? Yes, that comes from positive reinforcement. You don't tell people to do that. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and I hope you've learned something from this. And as I say, it's been my secret, and I've shared it with you. I hope it works. Thank you. Bye.